a continuous process that does not end with the classes and performances we do. By exploring the journeys of our fellow musicians, we open ourselves to new insights and inspirations in our own musical paths. We're excited to have Svetak Sundhar, who is here with us today. We extend a warm welcome to you. To begin, could you please give us a brief introduction about yourself and your gurus?
Sure. So I'm a Carnatic flute artist, and I grew up in this area. And I learned from Srimati Shantala Subramanyam, who lives in Chennai. And I've been learning for about the past 10 years.
Yeah. So to start, everyone knows that breathing techniques play an important role in flute playing. So how did you master these techniques, and do you have any tips for beginners?
Yeah, I think breathing technique in flute is a little bit like, it's like learning to roller skate or learning to even walk or something like that, where, it's like at first you try and maybe you're really tired and you get tired after 2 minutes, and then you try again, and then, suddenly 2 minutes becomes a little bit easier, and then you can go for 4 minutes, kind of like that. So I think it's one of those things that you just have to keep trying at, and then you somehow just kind of get. And probably anyone that's learned like the Western flute or even other woodwind instruments might be familiar. Like it's one of those things. It's a very feel-based thing, and I think anybody can do it. That's the good thing. But it just takes some time, just like learning how to roller skate or learning how to walk. And I think one of the things with flute specifically is that it's kind of how you blow, so like the angle in which you're blowing into the flute rather than how much air you're blowing, that is what actually takes time to master. So actually to blow a flute, you don't need to have that much air, you just have to have it at a very specific kind of angle, and that's kind of what you master over the time. Yeah.
The Carnatic flute has also been used in fusion music. How do you feel about its evolution into the more contemporary genres?
Yeah, I think it's a great thing, and I think it's one way that Carnatic music can spread even further, and specifically instrumental music, because with instrumental music you don't have the barrier with like lyrics that sometimes people may not understand that are not familiar with the form, and so I think it's a great way to sort of work with musicians of other genres and sort of have introductions into Carnatic music, and suddenly in something like a jazz club, people might be hearing Carnatic music without even knowing what it is, and that's, I think, a great thing and a very natural way for it to spread. And I think there's a lot of collaboration opportunity even with other Indian genres of music. So for example, like Rajasthani folk musicians or just other musicians in the Indian subcontinent that have similar forms of music, that there's a lot of scope for things like jugalbandis and things like that.
Are there any kritis or compositions that you find particularly difficult on the flute, and why? Yeah,
I think in general, in terms of like, not necessarily kritis or composition, but in terms of like ragam specifically, I think your stereotypical ones like Todi and Saveri and Bhairavi and things like that. There's like a lot of nuance, just as you might know in singing, that you also have to kind of have on the flute, and it's easy to sometimes miss out on detail. So sometimes like even if you played it right at one point in time, you have to if you do it a while later, you have to kind of go back and make sure you have all those small details intact. And I think in general, anything with the Shuddha Re, so like the Re 1, is difficult on the flute, because actually when you're playing it on the flute, you're actually just covering half the whole. So it's kind of like, this is why I don't encourage learning like Maya Malabagola as the first ragam that you learn, because it's actually quite difficult on the flute. So like, for example, if you're just playing the Re 2, it's just, which is not so bad, but then if you have to play with the Re 1, you have to kind of have this like half closure, and that takes some time. So it's like, and that motion is kind of hard. So sometimes in the fast speeds, that's a little bit difficult to get correct.
In your journey with the flute, has there ever been a moment or in a performance or practice that you realized was a turning point for you?
Yeah, I thought my flute Arangacham was a turning point kind of on its own. And this happened in September 2019. So before that, the longest I'd ever performed was like a 20-minute concert. And so that concert specifically for my Arangacham was like almost 1 hour, 40 minutes. So it was a big jump. And I think, getting to that point, so like working hard over the summer and having like extremely regular lessons and sort of building up the stamina to do that maybe 3 or 4 month period was like a pretty big turning point. And kind of after that gave me the confidence that I could handle much longer length concerts.
Do you think there are any rare ragams or compositions that are especially suited for the flute and they deserve more recognition?
Yeah, so in terms of compositions or ragams, I don't think there's anything in specific that comes to mind. There are a few ragams that actually work very nicely on the flute. So for example, Dharmavati or Bhaganeshwari, where they, on the bass flute, you can really get these deep tones. I think that kind of effect is very hard to get in any other instrument or vocal. But I think in terms of, ways you can present kritis or compositions on the flute, there's a lot of, things that can be brought out of the flute. So for example, deep ragams like Sindhu Arabi, playing it on a bass flute and things like that, that adds a totally different dimension. I think more in terms of the presentation on the flute, there's some things that can be brought out more versus just, different ragams or kritis necessarily.
What is one piece of advice that you got from your guru that has stuck with you throughout your entire music journey?
Yeah, so I think from my guru or even just other music teachers that I've had in general, I think sort of the biggest piece of advice is, when you're in the practice room or in a lesson, just approach everything with a very beginner mindset. But when you're on stage, you should really look like a magician, someone that's kind of the master, and you're ultimately performing at the end of the day. And this becomes more and more true as you start performing more and more, because people are often spending precious time or hard-earned money even sometimes to come watch you perform. And so your job is to entertain them. And so I think, the biggest advice that I live by is that, when you're in the practice room and everything, kind of, be a beginner, make many mistakes, kind of work very hard and approach everything with a beginner mindset. But when you're on stage, you're really the one in command. And so it should look like a magic show. Like, for example, you don't see magicians kind of second guessing themselves when they're doing a magic show, because that wouldn't be so fun to watch. So it's the same idea with a musician.
Yeah, I think that's definitely good advice anyone can follow. Did you receive formal training in vocal music? If so, how did this help with your improvisations? And if not, how did you achieve perfection in your learning stages without vocal training?
Yeah, so when I was very young, I learned a little bit of vocal, but I think this is sort of like a very good / debatable point, because I think it's very important to have a very good understanding of vocal music, but I don't necessarily think that means that you have to be a good vocalist on its own. So for example, it's the same idea with the rhythm. Like, it's important to have a good idea of rhythm, but you don't necessarily have to be playing the rhythm on your own to be, a good musician per se on the flute. So I think one thing that I do, like all of my lessons, generally my teacher is singing and I have to reproduce what she's singing directly on the flute. So it's not so much that I necessarily have to sing it back, even though sometimes I do, but typically it's like trying to reproduce exactly what she's singing with nuance on the flute. And it gets interesting because, on the flute, there's it becomes subjective a little bit, right? And this is where your deep understanding of vocal music helps. So for example, if I just play Vasanta Varnam, first line, right? So it's so one way you can play it, maybe when you're starting off, is kind of like this, so that, the notes are all correct, right? But there was kind of a lack of some curves and things you might, in the way you would sing it. So actually, if you're trying to reproduce how you might sing it, it might sound more like this. Right? So that's kind of how you would sing it. And so you have to kind of hear in your mind when you're playing it how it would be sung, rather than just looking at it note by note. So in terms of training, I think I'm not I haven't learned vocal formally, but I am around it so much that I guess I have to reproduce it. So
you play both a string and woodwind instrument in two different styles. How has learning these helped or hindered the other?
Yeah, I think that's a lot sort of like being bilingual or something like that. So it's definitely not, it's definitely never hindered in any way. And I specifically chose doing different instruments like flute and violin because I knew that the technique wouldn't conflict with each other, and sometimes that can get confusing for students. But yeah, it definitely doesn't hinder in any way. In fact, it gives ideas that there's a lot of cross-pollination from one to the other. So for example, sometimes in Western music, even though there's not so much improvisation, there are things you can ornament while you're playing, and sometimes these South Indian ornamentations give inspiration to that. And similarly, when you're playing sort of on Carnatic music, some compositions are more Westerny in some sense. For example, Raghuvamsa Sada and things like that can often have a very nice effect instrumentally. And so I think they've actually quite gone hand in hand rather than the opposite. Yeah, I think I've benefited a lot from also just the teachers of the different styles of music and how they approach music. So, for example, Western music, there's a very serious emphasis on like presentation quality and posture and things like that. And that I've kind of been able to take those lessons with me into Carnatic music. And so I would say like when I started learning Carnatic music, that education definitely helped me quite a bit with the head start.
Would you say that you would encourage beginners or instrumentalists to pick up another instrument?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of just like do what you are really curious about and enjoy. So like don't necessarily pick up an instrument just if you think it might help you with like learning another style of instrument, but if you're actually just very curious about the kind of music and instrument itself, I think you should just go for it. And yeah, like maybe at the same time it can be hard. I think it's good to have some grounding in music. So for example, knowing how to be in tune, what's in tune, what's not in tune, and knowing what's in rhythm and not in rhythm, things like that. But after that, I think it's definitely free to explore, and it really depends on what you want to do with music. If you want to be like an expert performer in one thing, or you want to have a good understanding of many things. And there's no right answer.
Yeah.
What was the most difficult portion of your learning curve? Like the jump from Varnam to Kriti, Kriti to Manodharma, and so on?
Yeah, so I think in terms of Varnams, I think, they're still quite hard no matter how many times you play them. Like, for example, like whenever I have to perform an Attatala Varnam, I'm always kind of hoping I have enough energy to do it because it's quite long. I think, at least for me, what I find difficult and what I'm actively working on is kind of working on different Kalpanaswarams and the different kinds of Dalams. So, for example, how you play something in Adi Dalam shouldn't really sound like how it might come in Khanda Chapu or Mr. Chapu or something else. So I think kind of experimenting with the different kind of Dalams is probably what I find difficult in terms of growth. I think Kritis, more generally, it's kind of something that can be mastered if you just put enough like repetition into it. You play it and then you get some feedback, you correct some feedback again, you play it back, and eventually it kind of resolves to something that works out well. But I think sometimes these more creative aspects, like Alapana specifically, and also Kalpanaswaram, those kind of there's no end to those, right? Like that's really what distinguishes an artist sometimes at the very higher levels, and so. Really kind of putting in those emphasis on like, what are the different rhythms really and how can these sound different? How like these should not sound the same, and so what are different phrases you can play in one dalam versus another? So I think that takes quite a bit of time to kind of grasp.
How did you sustain your interest and continue your passion throughout your high school years?
Yeah, so in high school I was part of quite a few orchestras playing Western violin and things like that, and so I think naturally, just because of like how many things I signed up for, I just had to go to them, and so there was kind of no way of like, even if I didn't practice so much on my own, it's like by just going to these different things, that would be a practice in itself. And I kind of, over time, you sort of kind of realize like if that's what you enjoy, then that's something that's working well for you. So like for example, I kind of realized when I would go to these orchestra rehearsals and things like that like. If I was tired or like in a bad mood or something, like after that it would be completely cleared out. And so that was, in a way, it was quite a bit of like relaxation, and it sort of balanced like the other academics and things I had to do in high school. And so I think like it wasn't so much that I felt like I was forced, even though like there was also a big community around these orchestras and things like that, and with auditions there's natural like fun and some pressure built in. So I think the biggest things of sustaining through high school are like one, finding a good community that you really enjoy sort of the people, and then two, if kind of doing music or going to these musical events is something that sort of relaxes you or brings you enjoyment. And I think if those two are there, then it like the other stuff becomes secondary, like how good you are or anything like that. That's all secondary. It's more of just something you enjoy doing, and you're kind of part of that system and society.
So of course posture plays a big role in flute playing. How do you think posture can affect the sound quality of the flute and the overall performance?
Yeah, so I think when you have a good posture, it's sort of like the air is coming from your lungs, so it just makes that kind of windpipe or like the kind of air to come from your lung just easier and not constrained. So for example, one thing I work on to even make sure I have good posture is I try to consciously make an effort to like kind of look up while I'm playing, because that kind of guarantees I'm like sitting up straight. Sometimes like if the mic is lower, like if I'm on a stage and the audience is lower, I might like kind of try to bend down to sort of get eye to eye with them. But I think, just looking up is something that helps. But yeah, for example, if you're sort of playing something having a good sort of core strength and a good posture helps a lot in just making that air come out more easily. So you actually get tired less easily doing that. So like, for example, if you're just kind of like this, so that is like, it's much easier to do that than kind of if you're kind of hunched a little bit like this and you have to, like over time that tiredness kind of builds up because you have to work harder to get the air out of your system. And so I think just having a good posture just makes it easier for you. And ultimately, as like an instrumentalist or a vocalist, you want to do as many things as possible to just make it easy for you to kind of perform. So posture is one thing, but even like finger positioning is kind of along those same lines. Like, for example, if you're playing something, you don't want to like remove your fingers so high and all the time. Like sometimes you just want like subtle movements, and that just makes it easier to play faster things. You have to work less hard, and that's always great as an instrumentalist.
Becoming a masterful flute player is not just about hitting the right notes, it's about hitting the right notes at the right time. How did you develop a sense of dalam?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's something that like still actively working on. So I think one thing that's helped quite a bit is like I perform in the orchestra for quite a few Bharatanatyam arangetrams and performances and productions and things like that. That actually helps quite a bit with these sort of like knowing when to play and when not to play. For example, sometimes there'll be something going on, or maybe the dancer is doing one extra step, and so the singer sometimes just points to you and just kind of asks you to play a little bit, and you can't kind of come to that moment and say like, oh, I haven't like prepared anything or practiced. You just kind of have to go like on the spot. And so I think that really helps for one thing, like in your ability to improvise or kind of put things in rhythm that make sense at the moment. And it's sort of the same idea in music. I think sometimes in solo concerts it's a little bit easier because maybe you're kind of setting every kind of expectation or tone, but you still need to have a conversation with your like violin artist if they're accompanying you, or like mridangam artist. It can't just be like you're kind of going your own way and you're not listening to them at all. So I think in general the biggest tip is just kind of playing with other musicians as much as you can, and naturally your ability to like know what sounds good at the right time and what doesn't gets refined over time. And with dalam and stuff like that, there are definitely exercises that you learn to like build up your understanding of dalam, but that alone doesn't do it, right? Like just because you know all these things doesn't mean you can actually execute them at the right time. And so where you learn to do that execution, I think, is just by playing with other musicians and listening quite a bit to other musicians online.
So flute playing does require quick reflexes and accurate finger positions. So do you do any training or practice before you perform?
Yeah, so I think in general, like this is something where like when I was younger, I would kind of take for granted because it's like, okay, you have a lot of energy, you can kind of just move your fingers fast and like they move like the way you want. But I'm sort of realizing as I grow older and like you have like age on your side less and less, like you actually have to do these exercises to sustain those reflexes and things like that. So yeah, my teachers devise like many step exercises, and there's many just things you would do in vocal music that you do the same thing on flute. And those basic exercises give you like fluency over the instrument. And I think that's always important to do. But I think in terms of maintaining your reflexes, sort of like I responded in the previous question, it's just about playing with other musicians as much as you can and listening as much as you can. Because if you know what you want to do in your mind, then getting it on the instrument shouldn't be too bad. Provided like you've done some practice ahead of time and things like that. And when you're sort of in these positions where you have to just kind of do something on the spot, I think that's the best kind of practice, because you're like, you can't prepare for that per se, but your musicianship should kind of carry you through, and your understanding of things should be able to carry you through. So actually, like ironically, I would recommend for musicians to develop that skill just to be in as many positions as you can where you don't feel prepared enough, and then just kind of figure out how to navigate it in an improvisational way. Like, I'm not saying like don't practice a kriti and go perform it or something, but I'm saying like, for example, if you're working with a dance teacher or something like that, and you may not 100% have memorized everything you're going to play, like in an improvisational portion, like figure out how to get through that anyway. And I think that's a really valuable sort of skill to have.
So we know that your dad is a veena player. How has growing up with music in your house influenced you as a musician?
Yeah, I think it's been huge. I think, in the past and when I was really young, they used to host musicians at home and things like that. And that was a really, eye-opening experience. Even from when you're extremely young, just having, hearing music in the house when you're so young, I think is just very nice in general, because suddenly you may develop an interest in it, and when you're very young, it's like you don't think about so much of these other things, right? It's just you and the music, and so I think that sort of spark is very important sometimes. And so definitely, I credit my parents quite a bit to that. But also like sort of the household that they've been able to sustain over time. So like my dad continues to learn, and then my mom has been very supportive in like sort of bringing us to these musical events and things like that. My sister's like, she does Bharatanatyam, but she also learned Carnatic music. So I think just having that like shared understanding between everyone at home is, makes for a very nice sort of environment to be able to like learn and practice music and continue growing kind of at the end of the day.
Now we'll be moving on to the rapid fire questions. So, do you prefer alapne or kalpana swarams?
Alapana.
Who's your favorite flutist? Other than your guru?
Yeah, so my guru's brother actually sort of, like, we hosted him when I was extremely young, so that's Flute Shashank, and I think that was something that inspired me quite a bit because I was very young, and he was also sort of in his, like, late teens, and he was performing a lot, and that kind of young energy, I don't know, somehow gave me a lot of enthusiasm and liking, and so I would say him, but also, many contemporary flutists today. Shruti Sagar is a great one, Flute Jayant is also a great one, so there's many great flutists.
Do you have a kriti you prefer to listen to or play on the flute?
Kriti, I think there's so many good classics out there, like in Nalina Kanti, Manavyala Kinchara, that's a great one. There's many, honestly, a lot of the classics are just great to play on flute. Some of these rare kritis, they're tricky because they're generally not performed so much because it's very hard for an audience to understand the lyrics behind them and sort of what's going on because it's just you're hearing sounds. So I think the best kritis, and especially the ones I like to play, are often the common ones, but that everybody knows, but they're relating to a different sound on an instrument versus vocally.
Is there a mistake that you learned from that you felt was really important to you?
I think in terms of mistakes, so there's always technical mistakes from concerts and things like that, but I think those are not so much of the important ones. I think a lot of sort of in some sense mistakes that I made when I was a lot younger were a lot more around not letting one mistake bog you down in a concert and sort of being able to keep going. I think those are the greatest learnings, because if you're kind of letting one mistake kind of take over your whole concert, that's not good. And so that's something that you can really learn from. So I think ironically, when you perform, it's yes, it's about minimizing your number of mistakes, but I think what's even more important is to be able to recover from it and keep going and continue to deliver a great concert and not let that stop you. So I would say that's maybe a big sort of thing that I learned when I was younger.
Yeah. So apart from the flute and the Western violin, which instrument would you be interested in exploring?
I think maybe percussion instrument might be a good one. So maybe tabla or mridangam would be nice, but also nadaswaram is also something that I've been really interested in, just because that I feel can reproduce the human voice even closer than the flute or the violin or almost any other instrument I can think of can. And so yeah, maybe one day I'll get to try that.
Well, that wraps up today's interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here and share these insights with us.
Yeah.
We hope many upcoming musicians can relate to these situations. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in our future episodes.